Hello, my name's Steve Capel. I'm project lead of UNECE Recommendation 49 called Transparency at Scale. It's an anti-greenwashing measure to improve transparency in supply chains in order to help the globe meet sustainability outcomes. Let's look at the motivations for Recommendation 49. First of all, the world faces some sustainability challenges like climate change, biodiversity, water consumption, modern slavery, and so on. Regulators around the world are responding to these challenges. Examples like the European Union Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, Due Diligence Directive, deforestation regulation, plus the United States Inflation Reduction Act are all designed to drive behavior and provide incentives for that behavior towards improving sustainability outcomes. Capital markets too. Easier to get a loan when you can provide evidence of sustainable behavior. And this all starts to provide meaningful incentives. For example, a carbon border adjustment mechanism at the current European price of around 80 or 90 euros a ton is quite an incentive to reduce emissions in the footprint of your products shipped to Europe. Similarly, just access to markets. If you can't prove deforestation compliance, then markets may be closed to you, for example. So these are important drivers, but equally, they're important drivers that will encourage increased greenwashing, which is already fairly endemic. Some 40% of claims are either misleading or fraudulent, and some 60% of claims have no evidence. So just as the incentives are increasing to behave sustainably, so the same incentives will increase the motivation to get away with telling fibs. So in order to maintain the value of those incentives, we really need to combat that greenwashing through transparency. Now, that's easy to say and hard to do. There are a lot of challenges to achieving that supply chain transparency at scale. And that's the purpose of Recommendation 49. So let's look at some of these challenges. First of all, the idea of providing traceability through digital information across supply chains isn't new. There are hundreds, maybe thousands of platforms to choose from. Many of them, in fact, have a model where they expect participants along the entire supply chain to provide traceability data to that platform so that an end-to-end picture can be constructed. Sounds reasonable at first, but when you think about it, you quickly realize that that's not going to scale to global levels. It's almost like saying we can all pay each other any money as long as we all have an account at the same bank. The world doesn't work like that. There are tens of thousands of banks, and standards exist for money to flow between banks. So in exactly the same way, we need to establish a protocol for traceability data to move between platforms so that any actor in the supply chain can pick any platform they like or any tool they like, as long as it conforms to an interoperability protocol. Another challenge is there's a mountain of standards. There's maybe 300 or 400 industry-led ESG standards in agri-food and textile and leather alone, plus hundreds and soon to be thousands of emerging items of regulation all around the world, present really a bewildering challenge to any producer in any market, particularly when that producer is looking to sell goods to export markets and has to meet the compliance requirements of that export market. So we want to find a way to simplify that plethora of standards, make sense of claims that are made in one country so they're understandable in another, and keep that assessment simple by separating the facts from the assessment of those facts. Another challenge in traceability and transparency at scale is confidentiality. It's easy to understand how an actor is willing to share data between their immediate suppliers and their immediate customers. But as soon as you step one or two steps beyond that, there's a risk that confidential information starts to leak into the supply chain. And actors are generally going to be very reserved about participating in end-to-end traceability if they're not confident that confidential information can be protected. So we want to have a protocol that empowers every actor in the supply chain to choose their own balance between traceability and confidentiality, and share data when it delivers material value to do so. Finally, this whole landscape is almost bewilderingly complex, quite expensive sometimes to comply, and there needs to be a clear business motivation. Benefit has to be higher than cost for anyone to take action. So we really want to make sure that traceability and transparency protocols that we develop at the UN are really simple, cheap, implementable, can work at scale, and have an almost negligible cost impact. And that's so that any available margin or incentive are actually available and spread through the supply chain for each actor to actually change their behavior. So the UNCFACT Transparency Protocol, UNTP, aims to solve these problems and take us from a few hard work pilots to global adoption at scale. So just a reminder that this is a protocol, not a platform. We're not building another IT system. We're actually defining standards and protocols to connect them together. That means leaving data where it is, but linking it together when it's needed. The blue dots represent islands of information, and they need to be connected together to follow the dots, if you like, for a particular supply chain. For example, here's a very simplified lithium mine to electric vehicle supply chain: cobalt from Africa, lithium from Australia, through China-based battery manufacturing to an electric vehicle in Europe. Or here's one for cotton to t-shirt through Asian economies ending up in Europe again. The point is, there will be thousands of platforms, millions of value chains, and billions of transactions. A traceability and transparency protocol must recognize that and must work at scale. So let's have a quick overview of how this protocol might actually work. Right at the heart of it is the idea of a simple business-to-business digital product passport containing just enough information for the next step in the supply chain to leverage it. And just enough is an important factor here. This is a clear separation between rich and largely confidential data in any business and the minimum amount needed to inform, for example, Scope 3 emissions in the next step in the supply chain. So that passport is at the granularity of a shipment of goods and linked to the products in those goods. Now, it's one thing to make claims about sustainability in those passports, but how to link trust to those claims? Well, the rich and confidential information held by most businesses will often be audited by some kind of competent authority or certifying body. And the output of that is an independent assessment of conformity against a particular criteria, whether that's EU deforestation regulation or carbon intensity or whatever. And so simple conformity credentials, digital again, that just state conformity with the criteria without sharing the sensitive data behind it, but coming from a trusted third party, are a good way to achieve that. And similarly, end-to-end traceability. I mentioned before, this is a decentralized protocol that needs to work over thousands or hundreds of thousands of those blue dots. So if there's no central database where all the information lives, how do you draw an end-to-end traceability picture? Well, the answer is through simple traceability events. A fairly well-established standard exists to do that. Now, if those traceability events and those conformity credentials are linked to that digital passport, then what we have is just enough data for the next step in the supply chain to make their ESG assessments, linked to something they can trust, and also linkable to further deeper steps in the supply chain to follow the end-to-end traceability and establish the provenance of the goods. Now, very importantly, that minimum set of data is not shared directly between parties or between systems, more importantly, because we don't even know what systems and the next party in the supply chain uses. What we do is link those goods to the physical shipped product. So if you've got a thing, you can find out data about a thing. Using a barcode on a product, even if it's a one-dimensional barcode and not a URL, simple protocols to resolve an identifier on a product, could be a product identifier, a batch identifier, or a shipment identifier, to the ESG information about that product, is a way to effectively share that data. And also make sure that that data is understandable and consumable, irrespective of the technical maturity of the recipient. So a manual process, simply scanning the barcode, and a human experience of clicking through evidence, or a machine following the same evidence, should work equally well. So this is basically the behavior that one actor in the supply chain would need to follow. But how does this look if we glue all of that together into a full supply chain? Here's an example. In this case, a red meat supply chain, starting from cattle farms and grain farms that feed the cattle through a feedlot and a processor, and then getting exported. But very similar pattern would apply for lithium mine to electric vehicle or building and construction or other supply chains. So each actor in that supply chain, using the tools of their choice, not imposed by anyone else, will do what they do today, really, but digitally, and publish, as I showed in the previous slide, credentials, digital data that's human readable too, that is the result of their work. So in this case, a state government might be the authority for attesting to deforestation claims. A cattle farm would produce a livestock passport and a movement event, and so on. The value of the traceability events is that at any point in that supply chain, given access to a passport through the identifier of the goods that's linked to that passport, I can start following the dots and build that traceability picture, including the trusted credentials that give me confidence that the claims are true. Now, this may seem complex, but actually we've done pilots in various parts of the world, including one in Australia, where a number of technology providers managed to implement this protocol in a matter of weeks and generally have made it available to their customers as just normal part of a product upgrade. So the cost, at least in the technology side, of complying with this protocol is almost arbitrarily close to zero. So final thing to mention, we're not inventing this from the ground up. We're building on existing very good work. The World Wide Web Consortium has developed a couple of standards called verifiable credentials and decentralized identifiers, which is the technology underpinning of all those passports and conformity credentials and traceability events that you saw in previous slides. GS1, the company behind pretty much every barcode on every product on most supermarket shelves, has defined digital link protocols to discover information given an identifier of a product, but those protocols are not limited to GS1. They can be used generally for any identifier. And EPCIS events is the standard behind those blue traceability events that I described before. The UN itself is already defining standards for conformity credentials and will develop a B2B digital product passport standard through this work. I also mentioned the IFRS Sustainability Alliance. Why is that? Because IFRS, which has for decades been the financial reporting standards that companies around the world have adhered to, are publishing sustainability standards. These are for reporting at the entity level, not at the product or shipment level. But if you think about it, a digital product passport containing ESG information linked to a shipment is the sustainability equivalent of a financial transaction like a payment or an invoice, and should aggregate up to a corporate view with a fairly clear line of sight. Just as financial transactions aggregate up to balance sheets and profit and loss accounts, so do digital product passports aggregate up to give a sustainability picture at the corporate level. There should be a clear line of sight between those two. So you may have noticed, the more observant of you, that I didn't answer all the questions in my challenges. That's because I want to keep this video fairly short. There will be more to follow up that explain exactly how that confidentiality transparency challenge is met, and also how the plethora of standards are simplified. But I'll leave those answers for subsequent videos. There is a little bit of work done already, which you may want to explore. A draft digital product passport, a draft conformity credential, and product traceability events. But that's it for now. This recommendation is under development. It's due to be published formally in middle of next year, but for public review in January or February next year. Anyone that is interested to contribute to it, or may be interested to sign up as an early implementer, should contact me as project lead at the address given here. Thank you for listening. Look forward to making the next video.